Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on Patristics, Fathers of the Church, Christian Antiquity. Last time we read the excerpt from Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, from his Church History, Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 1 and 2, in which he described the dispersion of the apostles throughout the world. And he mentions Peter. So we will talk about St. Peter's first stay in Rome from the years 42 AD to 49 AD, and then move on to St. Paul's missions. So Peter, as Paul later would, made it to Rome by the same route. Made landfall in Italy by ship at Puteoli, which is the modern town of Puzzoli. It was established, one of the Greek merchant colonies we talked about earlier in the course. This one was established in 521 BC. It was absorbed by Rome in 194 BC. From Puteoli, Peter could walk up the Via Appia, the famous Appian Way, north for 170 miles to reach Rome. Entering Rome from the Via Appia required stopping at the Porta Capena, which is the gate to Capua, for questioning by guards. Needing to earn a living, St. Peter found lodgings in the working class section of Rome. So he entered the city, then walked all the way through it, crossed the Tiber River to the other side, to the Trans-Tiberum, which just means across the Tiber. It is the 14th district of Augustan Rome, the modern Trastevere in Rome, which is south of the Vatican Hill. So he settled in the working class heart of the city. Now, back across the Tiber River, crossing the Pons Sublicus, the bridge, then between the river on the eastern side, between the river and the Circus Maximus, were the markets. So whatever you did for a living, if you wanted to, or as a working class person, whether you grew crops outside of the city or caught fish, which is probably what Peter did, or if outside of the city you raised pigs or goats or anything and butchered it and wanted to sell the meat, that's the area you would go. The area on the eastern side of the Tiber, between that and the Circus Maximus. There were two markets, one the Forum Venalium, which just means the selling market, to sell pretty much anything, and then the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, although it was meat. Generally, it's the meat would be sold. And that would be an ideal place for a fisherman to convert his catch into coin. Moreover, the Trans-Tiberum on the western side of the river, modern Trastevere, where Peter lived in his first day, contained the oldest synagogue, Jewish community in Rome. The oldest synagogue in the city is still standing in the neighborhood. For Christians, the Basilica of de Santa Maria in Trastevere and Santa Cecilia in Trastevere are two churches that share the winding streets, and they are still there. St. Peter settled in Rome by mid-November 42 AD, at which point he had an unwelcome surprise by meeting again Simon Magus. Simon Magus, acting as an apostle of Satan, was spreading a paganized mutilation of Christianity. He went from Samaria to Antioch to Ephesus, then to Rome. Just as Peter had rebuked Simon in Samaria and then repaired the damage in Antioch, Peter had to contend with the problem once more in Rome, the problem of Gnosticism, which is so Simon Magus, if you recall, he offered to pay Saints Peter and John for the power to summon the Holy Spirit, as he was already He was a Samaritan. He was someone who which they already had been subjected to syncretism for centuries, and he was one who believed in magic. He was practiced theurgy, and that blending of Christianity with paganism, specifically the belief in magic, is going to result in Gnosticism. It would plague the church for centuries, and in some ways is still with us in the New Age cults. Demonstrating that pagans really will worship anything. 100 years later, St. Justin Martyr found a statue of Simon Magus on an island in the Tiber River. So people were actually worshiping him as a magician. After he was dead, of course. Now, even though Simon Magus died soon after Peter arrived in Rome, and Peter did mount an effective defense in the moment, nevertheless, the Gnosticism he invented, that Simon Magus invented and promoted, remained a bane to the church for centuries. And Eusebius discusses their encounter in Book 2 of his church history, chapters 13 through 16. For the sake of time, I won't read all of it. And then the Justin Martyr mentions seeing the statue in his first apology, paragraph 26. So back to Peter in Rome. Some members of the Trans-Tiberium Jewish community, after hearing about Peter's assertions with regard to an executed carpenter fulfilling messianic prophecy, became hostile, just as many would with St. Paul when they heard the same thing. They regarded it as blasphemy. So that hostility forced Peter to relocate back to the eastern side of the Tiber River. We can trace his steps. The Parroquia di Santa Prisca, the parish of St. Prisca on the Aventine Hill, contains a baptismal font that he used to bring the Gentile St. Prisca into the church. This memorialized St. Peter's second base of operations in Rome, and that saint, St. Prisca, later suffered a hideous martyrdom during the persecution of Nero, along with Peter and many other Christians, which we'll cover later in the course. Through St. Prisca, he met her extended family, including Quintus Cornelius Pudens, who was a Roman senator. That senator's son, St. Pudens, provided another house church for Peter to use in Rome. And there, Peter established his seat in the city, the first seat in the city. Pudens remained so invested that St. Paul later mentioned him by name 2 decades later as an active member of the Christian community in Rome. Mentions him in Paul's second letter to Timothy, chapter 4, verse 21, and the same verse that Paul mentions by name St. Linus, who would later become the second pope after St. Peter's martyrdom. St. Pudens had 2 sons and 2 daughters. They also became Christian. Like his relative, St. Prisca, Pudens also suffered martyrdom with Peter during the persecution of Nero, which took place between 64 and 68 A.D. By 43 A.D., around 2 years after Peter arrived in Rome, the Christian community in Rome grew to the extent that the newly baptized requested a written account of the life of Jesus. John Mark, whom we've already met, no, we haven't met him yet, but John Mark, who's St. Mark the Evangelist, responded with what is now in our Bibles the second gospel. Mindful that contemporary biblical scholarship has asserted multiple theories regarding the authorship of the Gospels, and I'm not trespassing on your biblical courses, so here we will confine ourselves to what was believed at the time, what was believed in the patristic period, and simply quote St. Jerome, who is a father of the church and a doctor of the church who lived in Christian antiquity. He enumerated, St. Mark made it into his list of illustrious men as number 8, in which he records the following, quote, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, wrote a short gospel at the request of the brethren at Rome, embodying what he had heard Peter tell. When Peter had heard this, he approved it and published it to the churches to be read by his authority, as Clemens, this St. Clement later, in the 6th book of his Hypotyposis, and Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, record. Peter also mentioned this to Mark in his first epistle, figuratively indicating Rome under the name of Babylon. She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, salutes you, and so does Mark, my son. So, taking the gospel, which he himself composed, he, that's St. Mark, went to Egypt, and first preaching Christ at Alexandria, he formed a church so admirable in doctrine and continence of living that he constrained all followers of Christ to his example. Philo, most learned of the Jews, seeing the first church at Alexandria, still Jewish in a degree, wrote a book on their manner of life as something creditable to his nation, telling how, as Luke says, the believers had all things in common, as at Jerusalem. So he recorded that he saw was done at Alexandria under the learned Mark. Mark died in the 8th year of Nero and was buried at Alexandria. Annianus succeeded him. End quote. While Peter was in Rome, a terrible famine swept the empire from 42 to 45 A.D. Suetonius, who was a later later Roman pagan, but Roman historian, recorded that the Emperor Claudius was physically attacked by hungry mobs in Rome during this famine, barely escaped with his life. And that's in his Vita, his Life of Claudius, section 18. And another Roman historian, Tacitus, in his Annals, refers to the same thing in chapter 11, section 4. In the midst of this, we able to resynchronize with the New Testament, because the church at Antioch, demonstrating early on the Catholic understanding that all believers are of one church, one body of Christ, took up a collection and dispatched Saints Paul and Barnabas to bring it to Jerusalem. This is recorded in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Since the famine lasted 3 years, the precise date of their charity visit cannot be exactly determined, but between 44 and 45 A.D. is a plausible time frame since they met Mark in Jerusalem. Mark went to Alexandria, Egypt, in 43 A.D., but his mother was still living in Jerusalem. Therefore, a reasonable conjecture is that after a year or two of work, he traveled east along the coast, from Jerusalem along the coast through the Gaza Strip to get to Egypt, and then he could go back the same way through the Gaza Strip to get back to Jerusalem to visit Mom. St. Barnabas and St. Mark were cousins. We know this from St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 10, suggesting that Paul and Barnabas may have stayed at Mark's house while they were visiting Jerusalem, and there Barnabas was reunited with Mark, introducing him to Paul, and that Mark returned with them to Antioch to be part of the first missionary journey, as we shall see. Subsequently, at a date not preserved, during a prayer meeting of the Christians in Antioch, the group felt the Holy Spirit calling them to sponsor a more far-ranging missionary effort. As a result, they commissioned Barnabas and Paul to travel the world spreading the gospel. This is summarized in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. This developed into Paul's first missionary journey, which we will cover presently. Back in the Holy Land, on March 5th, 44 A.D., Herod Agrippa I, whom we introduced last time, grandson of Herod the Infanticide, returned to the Holy Land by Claudius to be client king, betrayed his erstwhile friend, the Emperor Claudius, capitalizing on the famine to lead an Eastern secession from the empire. That included the Holy Land. Essentially Herod's plan was to revive the Seleucid kingdom, which controlled the whole Levant, the Syria, Lebanon, the Holy Land, but under the Herodian dynasty, with of course himself as the monarch. Boldly announcing this publicly in the Roman base in the Holy Land, Caesarea Maritima, which is on the Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land, Herod then died hideously 5 days later, eaten by worms. And this is in the Bible. This is Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. Now, his popularity, his ability to try this, reveals that the Jewish desire for freedom had not gone away. After his death, that desire for independence submerged, but it didn't go away, and it would erupt again 25 years later, as we'll see. And then overlapping in that in time, I think we mentioned last time, in October of 42 AD, before his death, Herod Agrippa initiated a persecution of Christians, captured and executed St. John, son of Zebedee, by beheading, recorded in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Okay, so this catches us up, and now we move into St. Paul's first missionary journey. Again, these dates are conjecture, but we're conjecturing that it lasted from 45 to 49 AD. So it overlaps with the time that Peter was in Rome, and with the Herod's persecution, the execution of James, and then Herod's attempted secession, the famine in the empire, and Herod's attempted secession, and then his sudden death, overlapping all of that. Okay. So they're commissioned, Acts chapter 13, verses 1 to 3, and then the whole mission would be covered through all of Acts 13 and into 14, through chapter 14, verse 25. So they embarked, Paul and Barnabas embarked on their first journey, accompanied by John Mark. Depending on the length of time, well, no, I'll say that. Okay, so they started with familiar territory, actually. All right, so the maps are, not as detailed as we'd like, but just so I'm sure most, in your Bibles that you have, you have maps. So here's one of all of Paul's missionary journeys. So you can see. I can see where I am. It's not coming out because it's hard to hold up. But okay, so you see, here's the Holy Land, and this is the map of all three journeys, and you'll see that there's some overlap there. But so they're going to go from the Holy Land. Here's the island of Cyprus. Then they go to the southern coast of Turkey, and then over here on the second journey, when they go to Europe, it'll be in Greece. So I won't point out so now just keep that in mind. They started with familiar territory. They sailed 60 miles southwest to the island of Cyprus, which is 46 miles south of the southern coast of present-day Turkey. I say familiar territory because St. Barnabas was from the island of Cyprus. They were not starting in a void. If you recall, among the Christians who fled from Judea after the murder of St. Stephen the deacon, we were told in Acts chapter 11, verse 19, quote, that some traveled as far as Phoenicia, which is Lebanon, and Cyprus, end quote. Now we're told they preached to Jews only first, saying, okay, Jesus is the Messiah that we've been waiting for 1,000 years. Then some of these Cypriots, along with natives of Cyrene on the African mainland, the north coast of Africa, took a step farther by preaching at Antioch to Greeks also. And we're told that in Acts 11, chapter 20. The third largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, after Sardinia and Sicily, Cyprus was stolen for Rome by Marcus Porcius Cato. This is Cato the Younger in 58 BC. Saul, Barnabas, and Mark commenced the effort at Salamis on the eastern coast, famous for its temple to Zeus. They traveled the entire island until they reached Paphos on the opposite side, which boasted the oldest shrine to Aphrodite in the ancient world. It was thought to be the site of her first steps on land after her birth from sea foam. So you fans of Renaissance art, there's the famous painting by Botticelli, Venus on the half shell, so to speak. You know, she's standing on a shell of something and then landing on the island of Cyprus. That's the moment that Botticelli was preserving. More practically, in the New Testament period, Paphos was the seat of the Roman government of the island, who was Lucius Sergius Paulus. He was a former consul. You remember when we talked about the Roman Republic, all their magistrates only served for 1 year at a time. And the idea was that they would ascend through the cursus honorum, the course of honor, the ladder of honor. And then after the last two, after praetor and consul, they would be eligible to be appointed governor somewhere, and they'd have the title propraetor or proconsul. And the term's generally 5 years, but that could change. So he's a proconsul, meaning he had served a year as a consul. He was appointed in 47 A.D. He belonged to one of the most illustrious patrician families in Roman history. One of his ancestors conquered Macedonia, and another defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. A confrontation took place in his presence between Saul and a magician named Elymas, Elymas. So another pagan, engaged in theurgical arts. And the confrontation resulted in the conversion of Sergius Paulus, making him the first Gentile ruler, so to speak. I mean, he wasn't running Rome, but, so the first Gentile in real authority to become a believer. That's recorded in Acts chapter 13, verses 7 through 12. After this conversion, the name used by Saul of Tarsus changed to Paul. I've been calling him Paul just because that's what he's familiar. But in the Bible, all the accounts up to this point just refer to him as Saul. But in Acts chapter 13, verse 9, we read the following, quote, "But Saul, who is also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit," then goes on with the story. That's it. That's the first mention of the name Paul. So before Acts 13, verse 9, he's never called Paul, only Saul. After Acts 13, verse 9, he's never called Saul, but only referred to as Paul. So it's possible, but unprovable, that Saul adopted the name Paul to honor this convert of the highest Roman aristocracy. Or it could be, there's another hypothesis that many of the Jews, since they're a subject population, that they would have two names. That they would have a name they would use among fellow Jews, but that they also had another name that would be used in dealing with Gentiles. Either case, there's nothing dispositive, to assert. But so that quote, Acts 13:9, that is definite. Before that, he's never called Paul. After that, he's only called Paul. In any case, from Paphos, Paul and companions took ship, sailing northwest 60 miles for the mainland of what was then Anatolia, now is the nation of Turkey. They landed on the southern coast, and in the imperial usage, this was the province of Pamphylia in southwest Asia Minor. Today, it is the province of eastern Antalya Ili, Turkey. In the first century, this province spanned 75 miles of coastline, extending 30 miles inland from the Mediterranean north to the Taurus Mountains. It was absorbed into the empire by conquest in 50 BC, following genocide of residents for piracy. The Romans established the provincial capital at the 1,000-year-old city of Perga. It was an old Hittite city, 12 miles inland from the southern coast, up the course of the Sestris River. Today, the ruins are 9 miles east of Antalya, Turkey. The locals were enthusiastic worshippers of the goddess Artemis, the scantily clad huntress of the Greeks, and they were proud of their most famous son, the 3rd century BC mathematician Apollonius, who was a pupil of Archimedes, an explicator of geometric curves and cones. The city of Perga was a logical starting place for these religious ambassadors from Antioch to commence. Before they did, something happened. John Mark, St. Mark the Evangelist, cousin of Barnabas, left and returned to Jerusalem. Acts chapter 13, verse 13. St. Luke, who wrote Acts of the Apostles, but he had not yet joined Paul. Paul hasn't met him yet, but so he wasn't present for this. Luke provides no explanation at all. Just records the fact. Barnabas, in the moment, chose to remain with Paul instead of departing with his cousin. Now, whatever the cause of this, it poisoned the relationship of all those involved for years. But at the time, Barnabas and Paul continued as planned, which brought them to one of the famous Roman roads, the Via Sebaste, and they followed it, entering the region of Lycaonia and the province of Galatia. Now, those are the provinces of Ankara, Çorum, and Yozgat in central Turkey. This meant they had to cross the Taurus Mountains. Elevation 12,300 feet. The journey over exacted a heavy toll on St. Paul's physical constitution. As he later wrote to the Christians in Galatia, the province once he crossed the Taurus Mountains, then he was in the Roman province of Galatia. Quote, "You know that it was by reason of physical infirmity that I preached the gospel to you on the first of my 2 visits. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as a messenger of God." So he arrived sick, but obviously they cared for him anyway. Which means it must have been before they even converted. They just, it was just basic hospitality, which says a lot for people. And that quote, if you want to look it up, is Galatians chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. And this is another of these maddening omissions, in the New Testament. We never get everything that we want to know. So St. Luke does not record any details, and neither did St. Paul, about the infirmity. What was it? Was it altitude sickness or something else? Did he have a fall? Did he get an infection from a wound? Nothing. The closest we have is a later comment, which may be unrelated to this, could be a separate condition, but a later comment in which St. Paul self-deprecatingly apologized for writing in large letters, which suggests that his vision was involved. Maybe it was poor eyesight. Anyway, and that passage is in the same letter, Galatians chapter 6, verse 11. Now, whatever the condition of one's health, the Roman roads were a blessing for travelers. The empire knitted together its stolen territory by a network of roads spanning 53,000 miles. The one that they were using in this case was the Via Sebaste. Via just means way, so all the roads are called that, Via whatever. The nexus of the road was another city. The road led them to another city named Antioch. You remember the Seleucids, the old Seleucids. He named many cities Antioch. This one was in another one in the region of the long-vanished Hittite Empire, which after it broke, when the Hittite Empire broke apart, as with many of these empires, fragments formed successor kingdoms. This one was the kingdom of Pisidia, P-I-S-I-D-I-A. The ruins are northwest of Yalvac in the Isparta province in southwest Turkey. So this one is called Pisidian Antioch in the New Testament, to differentiate it from the sponsoring Church of Antioch on the Orontes River in Syria. Paul and Barnabas in Pisidian Antioch first preached in the synagogues of that colony, but then achieved greater success among the Gentiles. As a result, some Jews who regarded them as blasphemers, remember this, for Orthodox Jews, for faithful Jews who were still waiting for the Messiah, the Christian suggestion that over 1,000 years of prophecy would culminate in an executed carpenter from Nazareth, for them that was profoundly offensive and blasphemous, as they were waiting for another King David. Remember? So anyway, those Jews who regarded them as blasphemers stirred up sufficient trouble that they had to leave. Acts chapter 13, verses 13 through 52. So they got back on the Via Sebaste. They traveled southeast for 80 miles, which brought them to Iconium, that is modern Konya in Turkey, atop a 3,000-foot-high plateau in southwest Turkey. Iconium was the capital of Lycaonia, Lycaonia. That also had been part of the Hittite Empire around 1500 BC until it collapsed, and Lycaonia became part of the successor kingdom of first Pisidia. Then Pisidia was conquered by Phrygia, and then it went on and on. But until it was all stolen by Rome. Once again, Paul and Barnabas met with hostility in the synagogues, but acceptance from the Gentiles. Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 7. Continuing south on the Via Sebaste, 20 miles brought them to Lystra, Lystra. That is modern Klystra, near Gokayert in the Meram province, of Meram district of the Konya province of Turkey. In Lystra, they cured a man crippled from birth, resulting in the embarrassment of Barnabas being hailed as the god Zeus and Paul as the god Hermes, and a pagan priest trying to offer a sacrifice of an ox to them. Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 18. Meanwhile, some of the hostile Jews from Iconium and Pisidian Antioch arrived. Lystra had no synagogue, and they started a riot in which Paul was stoned. Remember, that's what happened to Stephen, that in the Old Testament, the penalty for blasphemy was execution by stoning. And he was dragged from the city to die. Acts chapter 14, verse 19. He recovered. Then Paul, and Barnabas returned to the Via Sebaste, walking 60 miles southeast to Derbe, Derbe. Acts 14, verse 20. Excavation of that site has yet to take place, but it is the site, at least, is identified conjecturally by archaeologists as Kurte Huyuk, 15 miles northeast of Karaman, Turkey. Once more, Paul and Barnabas met with success among the Gentiles. They then retraced their steps and then took ship for home, for Syrian Antioch on the Orontes River. Acts chapter 14, verses 14 through 28. Before departing, they appointed presbyters. Acts chapter 14, verse 23. By laying hands, first having a period of prayer, then laying hands on them, just has been done to them by the Christians in Antioch in Acts 13, verse 13. So in this way, Paul began creating a hierarchy, a priestly hierarchy. I mean, maybe it's too early to use that term, but an organization, a structure, priestly structure for the church, for the early church. And he continued this, as we see in his later letters, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14, and the letter to Titus chapter 1, verse 5. So the Greek word, I said appointing presbyters. So what is that? That's an English rendering of the Greek word used in the New Testament, presbyteros, which means elders. That was rendered in Imperial Latin as presbyter. Then in medieval Latin, it contracted to prestor, prester, Prester. Then in one of the successor kingdoms, after the Roman Empire fell, namely Germany, in Old High German, prester became prestar, and then in another, in Old English, prestar became Priest, and then as English developed into modern English, Priest became priest. So, in some writings that the authors will talk about presbyters as if they were not priests, but it's just a grammatical. It's just a linguistic thing. They are. It's the same word. It's just a word that has evolved because the church is 2,000 years old and language changes over 2,000 years. But to say presbyters were something other than priests, that just doesn't track linguistically. Okay, the first mission of Paul and Barnabas could have lasted between 3 and 4 years, starting at a point after the death of Herod Agrippa I in 44 AD, but before the appointment of Sergius Paulus to be proconsul of Cyprus in 47. So that gives us a range for the beginning of the mission. The mission ended sometime before 49 AD for reasons that we'll explain shortly. Paul and Barnabas and the faithful in Antioch who sponsored them had every reason to rejoice at the success of their efforts, which means you should already know, if you listen to all this from the beginning, you're okay. So success in service of the divine, service of the divinity and the faith, inevitably, what's going to happen? Satanic attack, all right? And that's depressingly predictable. It instantly manifested to undermine their work. Now, the demonic and Satan cannot just make us do anything. It has to be through temptation and manipulation. Writing years later, St. Paul described the spiritual dynamic. And I'll give you a quote. This is from his letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verses 17 through 20. Quote, I urge you, brothers, to watch out for those who create dissensions and obstacles in opposition to the teaching that you learned. Avoid them. For such people do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but serve their own appetites. And by fair and flattering speech, they deceive the hearts of the innocent. For while your obedience is known to all, so that I rejoice over you, I want you to be wise as to what is good, and simple as to what is evil. Then the God of peace will quickly crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus be with you. End quote. Specifically, Paul and Barnabas learned when they returned to Antioch that some Jewish Christian converts, called Judaizers, were telling Gentile converts that they could only follow Christ by adhering to every detail of the Mosaic law, including circumcision. That was a serious proposition for an adult male in a world of primitive medical treatment. No antiseptics, no antibiotics. So we're told this was the issue in Acts chapter 15, verse 1. Now, it's a legitimate question. Since Jesus was Jewish, all the first 12 apostles were Jewish. It happened in the Holy Land. The reference was to Jesus fulfilling prophecies delivered to Jews over a millennia. So, okay, well, is that true? Do they have to follow the Torah in its entirety? Well, only the apostles could pronounce a decision on such an issue. And as it happened, Peter was back in Jerusalem from Rome, owing to a circumstance that permits us to once more synchronize the lives of Peter and Paul and the New Testament with Roman history. Specifically, the fourth princeps et imperator, Claudius, commanded all Jews to leave Rome in 49 AD. The historian Suetonius who wrote the biography of Claudius 72 years later, explained the reasons as constant disturbances in the city among Jews of Rome over Christus. Now, being a pagan, Suetonius would not have understood or cared about disputes among Jews over whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. The record before him explained that Claudius was fatigued with the civil unrest over this dispute. Now, since Claudius was not a psychopath like his predecessor Caligula, he was content to simply banish the troublemakers rather than have them tortured to death over dinner, which is what Caligula would have done. Now, St. Luke does not even offer that much elaboration. He merely commented on the fact of the expulsion in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, to explain why Jews previously living in Rome, Aquila and Priscilla, were in Corinth when St. Paul visited that city. More immediately, and we'll meet them again later, more immediately in 49 AD, after the success of Paul's Gentile mission, the assertion of the Judaizers had to be resolved. How much of the Old Covenant was binding in the New? Acts chapter 15, verses 1 to 3. Owing to the expulsion of Jews from Rome, Peter was in Jerusalem when Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch. And then he was there when Paul and Barnabas went to Antioch to get a decision from the apostles. So this is the Council of Jerusalem. Now, in the most recent church council was Vatican II, which met from 1962 to 1965. That is enumerated as the 21st ecumenical council in our history. But this council, the Council of Jerusalem, is not included in that list of 21 because this is considered as having unique status because it's the only church council mentioned in the Bible in Acts chapter 15. So the subsequent, the 21, start after the Bible was finished. So the council that met after the Nicaea 1 in 325 is the first of the 21. Okay, so the biblical, the apostolic council, that's the most accurate, the apostolic council of Jerusalem. Peter joined Paul in arguing against the Judaizers, who held that one must first live as a Mosaic Jew before becoming Christian. Acts chapter 15, verses 7 through 11. This position was natural for Peter, since it was Peter, not Paul, who initiated Gentile baptisms without prior circumcision. Remember, we talked about that previously. Acts chapter 10, verses 44 to 48. When Peter baptized the Roman centurion, Cornelius, and his whole family, and witnessed the Holy Spirit descend on them, demonstrating that it was the will of God. The council bowed to the precedent set by Peter, and because Jesus had entrusted Peter with a special authority. Quote, Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 through 19. So Peter's example, his teaching, and his authority were definitive. The Apostolic Council of Jerusalem agreed with Peter, and therefore by association with Paul, that Gentile converts, meaning those who were pagan, but converting, becoming Christian, were not bound to observe all the precepts of Judaism, but they were required to sever from pagan practices. So what are those? The pagans practiced many things. And again, they didn't just you remember the hermeneutic of continuity. So even from their perspective, they were looking for guidance from what they knew of as the Bible, what we think of as the Old Testament. So they looked for precedent and guidance in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapters 17 and 18 outlined the conduct expected of Gentile visitors to the Holy Land living among the Israelites. So the Council of Jerusalem took that as guidance, that these Gentile converts to Christianity had to abide by that. Not all the details of the Mosaic Law, but this part of the Mosaic Law. So in Acts chapter 15, verses 22 through 29, the Council of Jerusalem adopted that same teaching to guide Gentile or pagan converts to Christianity, specifically based on Leviticus chapter 17, verses 7 through 9. They were forbidden to eat food sacrificed to idols, based on Leviticus chapter 17, verses 10 to 12. They were forbidden to consume blood, that is hematophagy, and based on Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 through 23, which is the third condition. They must abstain from carnal immorality. And I'm sure no one needs me to explain what that means. Moreover, the council recognized the Gentile mission as foretold by the prophets. Acts chapter 15, verses 15 through 18, which makes, again, the hermeneutic of continuity, so makes direct reference to prophecy, specifically Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 15, Amos chapter 9, verses 11 through 12, and Isaiah chapter 45, verse 21. So this decision remained normative in Christian antiquity and remains normative to this day. So with this endorsement, Paul could embark on his second missionary journey. And again, this is all theorized, but reasonable, not just made, an inference, but based on solid conjecture that it lasted from 49 to 52, and the details of which are recorded in Acts chapter 15, verse 36, through Acts chapter 18, verse 23. So Peter and Paul returned to Antioch after the council by April of 49. We find this elsewhere in Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Peter could not yet return to Rome until the edict of Claudius was rescinded, which turned out to be, he never did. So Peter was not able to return to Rome until after Claudius was poisoned in 54 AD, which we'll cover in due course. So Peter took his mission elsewhere, and we'll cover that. We'll cover what he was doing separately. Paul was anxious to visit the churches that he and Barnabas had established to see their progress. Acts 15, verse 36, records that. Barnabas also wanted to see that, but he wanted to bring along his cousin, John Mark, the one who had turned back at the foot of the Taurus Mountains. Barnabas was willing to give him a second chance, but Paul was not. Paul had no tolerance for weakness. Quote, "And there arose a sharp contention, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed." Acts chapter 15, verses 37 to 39. So Barnabas was from Cyprus, so that explains why he went there. Now this Silas, in other parts of the New Testament, he's also referred to as Silvanus. And the breach was serious. Paul didn't return to Cyprus because Barnabas was going to Cyprus. So this was it was apparently it was ugly. It was an ugly, fight or a rift. And instead he traveled overland, returning in reverse order to the churches he established, except, of course, that on Cyprus. Centuries earlier, the book of Proverbs warned of the underlying dynamic of this, which is, anger, wrath, one of the 7 deadly sins. Quote, "Fools give vent to their anger, but the wise, biding their time, control it." So Paul failed in that case, which of course is demonic manipulation. I mean, that's obvious. That quote from Proverbs is chapter 29, verse 11. Still, tragic though it was, the break was made. They continued, to serve the church, but separate paths. Paul embarked on his second missionary journey with Silas, walking north from Antioch, turning west to follow the coast 140 miles, bringing Paul to his native land of Cilicia, which is southeastern coastal Turkey. He returned to Derbe, 100 miles north of Cilicia, followed by another 30 miles northwest, brought Paul back to Lystra. In the course of this second visit to Lystra, St. Paul met St. Timothy. Acts chapter 16, verses 1 to 5. Timothy was the son of a mixed marriage. His father was a pagan Greek. His mother was Jewish. Her name was Eunice. Since Timothy's father forbade circumcision, but his mother ensured that at least Timothy knew the Torah and the prophets. Timothy's father was deceased by this point, and so perhaps, given how things developed, Timothy became the son that Paul never had, and Paul became a father figure with whom Timothy could share some understanding. So Paul circumcised Timothy. Acts chapter 16, verse 3. Now, I hear what you're thinking. Well, doesn't that contradict Paul's own argument? Well, okay. This was not because Paul was abandoning the ruling of the Council of Jerusalem, but rather Jewish descent was, and as far as I know still is, traced matrilineally, meaning through the female line. So Timothy, since his mother was Jewish, was technically Jewish. So he was technically not a convert. He was not a Gentile convert. Paul, Silas, and Timothy then went north to Iconium and northwest to Pisidian Antioch in the province of Galatia, arriving Acts chapter 16, verse 6. Then, while still in Galatia, Paul had another supernatural experience, as he had, in his conversion on the road to Damascus. The Holy Spirit prevented them from going west to Mysia or north to Bithynia. Instead, they turned northwest, going between the two provinces, aiming for Troas, Troas. Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 10. Now, that consists of 900 acres of ruins southeast of Dalyan, that is in the Kanakkale province of Turkey. During the New Testament period, Troas was certainly not in ruins. It was a port city, population around 100,000, straddling an important commercial route from the northwestern tip of what is now Turkey to Greece, on the other side, on the western side of the Aegean. In Troas, Paul received another infused grace, this one the grace of knowledge, in the form of a vision in the night, providing guidance in spreading the gospel of Jesus, just as St. Joseph had received with regard to the early life of Jesus. For Paul, the message was, quote, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Acts 16, verse 9. This brought the gospel into the heartland of Greek civilization, which, as we visited many times, which by this point was diminished. Greece was diminished in military power, yet it was still resonant with historic and literary and philosophical heritage. Moreover, Paul's stay in Troas brought into his little group of missionaries St. Luke, his eventual biographer, author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles. Now notice how Luke worded it years later, quote, "And when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia." Acts 16, verse 10. Focused as he was on the deeds of St. Paul, Luke gives himself no more introduction than a pronoun change in the narrative. So we have to find, who was this guy? Well, elsewhere, Paul describes Luke as a Gentile physician. Letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verses 10 through 14. And noted that Luke developed into an independent missionary for 7 years in Philippi, yet did return to Paul at Paul's time of need during his unjust imprisonment. Reference Philemon, verse 24, and 2 Timothy, verse 4, 2 Timothy, chapter 4, verse 11. Now, from extra-biblical accounts outside of the Bible, we learn that Luke was born in Antioch, was well-educated in the Greek language, composed the Gospel of Luke in Achaia, Greece, Achaia and Boeotia, both in Greece, based on Paul's teaching and others that he met, in the course of his journey, but primarily Paul. And he brought Acts of the Apostles up to Paul's 2-year incarceration in Rome. Paul referred to the gospel written by Luke as, quote, according to my gospel. So that, acknowledging that, that Luke based his gospel of Luke on Paul. And that's twice. Paul refers to it that way in his letter to the Romans, chapter 2, verse 16. Same letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 25. And in his second letter to Timothy, chapter 2, verse 8. So that quote, according to my gospel, means Paul was the primary source, along with other disciples Luke met through Paul. Luke does not record the circumstances of his first encounter with Paul or the circumstances of his own baptism. Instead, he summarizes their mission, quote, setting sail, therefore, from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, which is an island, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony, end quote. Acts chapter 16, verses 11 to 12. This brought them to Philippi, which we have already visited more than once, named for the father of Alexander the Great, Philip II of Macedon, stolen by Rome. And it had a gold mine, so, and that's why it was significant for the Romans. Paul commenced his European ministry in this same Philippi. So Philippi is on mainland Greece. So Troas is on mainland Turkey. Philippi is on mainland Greece. And Greece is considered Europe, so this brings it into Europe. Now, Philippi had no synagogue. So on their first Sabbath, Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke went outside the city, west to the river Crenades. Communities in a similar situation, meaning they had Jewish residents, but not enough to support a permanent synagogue, gathered instead and in a prosuke, which means a place to pray, usually near water, to perform the ritual ablutions. At the riverside, the river Crenades, Paul and his companions met a group of women, among whom was Lydia of Thyatira, a seller of purple dye. Luke honored her with a description similar to that applied to the Gentile centurion Cornelius in Acts 10, verse 2. Cornelius was among those who fear God, while Lydia was one who reverenced God, Sabomenoi, Tantheon. When Paul baptized Lydia and her household, and when he accepted her offer of lodging, he found a person with the knowledge, the experience, and the resources to cultivate and propel his mission. So we've referred to the red dye, the purple dye trade earlier with the Phoenicians. It was a luxury good. Only rich people could afford it. And so in order for a merchant to be able to trade in that, he, or in this case she, had to have a lot of money to be able to hold that kind of valuable inventory and pay to transport it. And then so she made a lot of, she made profit, and she had connections. Writing to the Philippians, a decade later, he wrote back to the Philippians around 62 AD. Paul remembered them with gratitude as he wrote to thank them for yet another gift of help. So 10 years later, they were still helping him. And in his letter to the Philippians, he thanks them by recalling their original help to him. Quote, "It was kind of you to share in my distress. You Philippians indeed know that at the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, not a single church shared with me in an account of giving and receiving, except you alone. For even when I was at Thessalonica, you sent me something for my needs, not only once, but more than once. I am very well supplied because of what I received from you through Epaphroditus." End quote. Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 through 18. Since Paul accomplished a great good for the church with the success of the first European mission, satanic attack is inevitable. After enduring many such onslaughts, Paul explained, quote, "We are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness." Now, he's reflected on that later. This was his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. In Philippi was one of those cases where he was not facing flesh and blood. I mean, it was presented, obviously, by, but being under demonic manipulation, specifically a demon masquerading as a god. Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 24. As Paul later wrote, quote, "What pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons." 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. Paul and Silas encountered a Pythian prophetess, whom pagans believed were empowered to speak oracles on behalf of Apollo. Acts 16, verse 16. She was a slave whose owners made a lucrative income charging for private prophecies, private readings. So this is analogous to fortune tellers and tarot card readers in our own time. A scam. Paul perceived, though, that this was more than a case of simple fraud. The slave was demonically possessed. The Torah forbade any use of divination. It's forbidden, specific necromancy and divination, forbidden in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10. And King Saul greatly displeased the Lord by disobeying this stricture. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 7 through 25. And recall that the Council of Jerusalem required Gentile converts to separate from former pagan practices, which, of course, this would include. St. Paul, so what does he do? So he sees this girl's demonically possessed. Well, what does he do? Paul had the example of Jesus to guide him, as recorded by Luke in Luke chapter 4, verses 33 to 35. Jesus performed an exorcism, so Paul did the same. He performed an exorcism on this girl. Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 18. This exorcism freed the slave girl from demonic possession, which of course was good for her, but bad for her owners because it deprived her owners of income. And they did not take that very well. Angry and vindictive, they aroused the population of Philippi into a spontaneous riot. So this is the first time that it's Gentiles doing this. Previously, the riots were caused by Jews who regarded Paul as a blasphemer. So this caused the Dumviri, the city magistrates, to inflict the fustiarium on them. It was a judicial corporal punishment was part of Roman law, which means to beat them with sticks. Acts chapter 16, verses 20 to 23. Now, even though the fustiarium was a recognized punishment, Roman citizens, which Paul was, were protected by Roman law from corporal punishment without due process. And there's some forms of punishment that a citizen was completely immune from, and that they could be punished, but not just for something like this, that a magistrate sees they're causing trouble and then beats them. So the magistrate, acted in haste before realizing that Paul was a Roman citizen. Once the magistrates realized this, they realized they could get in trouble now if Paul decided to make an issue of it. So they were happy to let him go. The missionaries were allowed first to return to Lydia's house, get their supplies, and then leave the city. Acts chapter 16, verse 40. St. Paul never forgot this. He described it as to another church that he established as a time of shame for him, as the first time that Gentiles turned. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. St. Luke remained in Philippi to continue the work, as he was evidently not present for the riot over the exorcised slave girl. So Paul, Timothy, and Silas departed. They got another Roman road. This is the Via Egnatia. It's Egnatia, which brought them to Thessalonica. Acts chapter 17, verse 1. We've also visited this place. It was named for a half-sister of Alexander the Great. During the duration of Paul's time in Philippi, between the baptism of Lydia and the riot over the exorcised slave girl, was not preserved in the record. So the arrival of Paul, Silas, and Timothy at Thessalonica could have been between 50 and 53 AD. Recall that Cassander of Macedon, who was one of the Diadochi, one of the successors of Alexander, established the city of Thessalonica in 315 BC, named for his wife, who was a half-sister of Alexander the Great. Thessalonica endured the parade of horrors that we've detailed earlier, that other cities went through, until it was stolen by Rome in 168 BC. It was integrated into the network of imperial roads by the Via Egnatia. While in Thessalonica, Paul, Silas, and Timothy stayed in the home of a Jewish convert named Jason, and he remained with them. He's mentioned in a later letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 21. And Paul made another 2 converts who committed themselves to his missionary work, Aristarchus and Secundus, who also are mentioned by name, Acts chapter 20, verse 4, and Acts chapter 27, verse 2. For 3 weeks, Paul attended the local synagogue, revealing to them that, following the reasoning still that, they have a right to know, the Jews have a right to know that what they were waiting for has happened, that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled their long-cherished prophecies of the Messiah. Following the by now very predictable trajectory, some elements of the synagogue embraced this, Acts chapter 17, verse 4, while others were deeply insulted at his assertion that a crucified carpenter could possibly be the anointed one of God. To them, Paul was guilty of blasphemy, meriting death. Acts chapter 17, verses 2 through 5. Violence ensued, and an attempt at judicial murder was made. So they tried, in this case, unlike just the stoning, which had occurred previously, here they tried to use the Roman courts, as Caiaphas did against Jesus, hurling a false accusation that the missionaries were, quote, subverting the empire. Acts chapter 17, verse 6, meaning treason, which, of course, is the death penalty. And that is based on the description of the Messiah as king. Acts chapter 17, verse 7. Paul, by now, he saw where this was leading. He did not want any of his new converts to suffer on his account, so he made a swift departure in the night, as he had done from Damascus and Jerusalem and Pisidian Antioch and Lystra. So Paul, Timothy, and Silas walked away from the Via Egnatia southwest to the Campania Plain, aiming for the Bermeon Mountains on the horizon, elevation 6,700 feet, now home to ski resorts, and called the Vermio Range, Vermio. Connecting this to what we talked about to earlier visits, the Vermio Range includes none other than Mount Olympus. They stumbled on a river, the Haliacmon, which was once the border between southern Macedonia and northern Greece, before Rome stole all of it, making such distinctions irrelevant. They followed the river, as they would have followed a road, for 60 miles southwest, which brought them to Berea. In modern Greece, it's Veria, Veria, but in the New Testament, it's Berea. That is 24 miles west of the Aegean Sea on the eastern slope of the range. They arrived, Acts 17, verse 10. Conversions in Berea took place among both Jews and Gentiles. Acts 17, verses 11 through 13. Among the converts was one with sufficient commitment to return with Paul to the other side of the Aegean for missionary work in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. This is Sopater of Berea, Sopater, named in Acts chapter 20, verse 4. Sufficient time elapsed for these conversions and for communication exchange between members of the synagogues in Berea and Thessalonica. Some of the more insistent members of the Thessalonian synagogue sent representatives to Berea to repeat their earlier performance. And this guy's a blasphemer, stirring up the crowd to make a disturbance of the peace in order to involve the local Roman authorities by blaming the Christians for the trouble. The converts in the town then bundled Paul out, so once again had to make a narrow escape, which brought him 24 miles to the sea, specifically the port of Dium, D-I-U-M, where he could catch a ship to anywhere else. By this point, after what are we up to, 5 cities, he had definitely overstayed his welcome for the moment. Timothy and Silas remained in Berea, just as Luke had remained in Philippi, suggesting that the implacable hostility manifested so repeatedly in Acts may have been as much or more so simply personal antipathy for Paul, rather than purely theological objections. Because Luke stayed in Philippi working for 6 years. Timothy and Silas stayed in Berea, and so anyway. But the escape and arrival at Dium, Acts chapter 17, verses 13 through 15. As it happened, Paul's flight from Berea, what is this? I'll deal with that later. Paul's flight from Berea brought him south, ultimately 250 miles, to one of the parent cities of Western civilization, which we have visited several times already, Athens. Quote, "So the brothers at once sent Paul on his way to the seacoast, while Silas and Timothy remained behind. After Paul's escorts had taken him to Athens, they came away with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible." Acts 17, verses 14 and 15. Here in Athens, well, we visited many times. We know what he found there. He encountered Epicureanism, Stoicism. To get there, he walked past, coming from the direction that he would have walked past Plato's Academy, once again, and Aristotle's Lyceum of the Patristics, and inside the city, the Stoa Porlake. Outside the walls, he walked through the city, but he needed a place to stay, and he had to work for it. So he walked out of the city on the eastern side of the walls, brought him to the slopes of Mount Hymettus. There he found a synagogue located in a village of quarry workers, and he worked there to earn some money. And he found his first venue to preach the gospel in Athens. I mean, technically it was outside of the walls, but you know what I mean. Acts chapter 17, verse 17. It appears that he spoke in the synagogue on the Sabbath, but on other days went into the agora to speak. The agora is the public space in a Greek city, as the forum is in a Roman city. So he spoke in the open, just like, as we've seen, other philosophers did the same in Athenian history. So that was not unusual. But to his chagrin, he was treated as such, as just another philosopher. Quote, "While Paul was with them, while Paul was waiting for them, meaning waiting for Timothy and Silas in Athens, he grew exasperated at the sight of a city full of idols. Therefore he debated in the synagogue with the Jews as well as those who feared God, and daily in the public square with whoever happened to be there. Even some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion. Some asked, "Who is this scavenger? What is the scavenger trying to say?" Others said he sounds like a promoter of foreign deities, because it was preaching about Jesus and resurrection. End quote. Acts 17, verses 16 and 18 through 18. No record exists counting the number of days Paul engaged in this activity, but he drew sufficient attention that he was brought before a public meeting on the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, which is west of the Acropolis. That's where the Boule met. That's like the city council. They met in the Areopagus. So he drew enough attention that he was brought to him before this, like the city council. Yet there's no indication it was a trial. Like there's no indication that he was accused of a crime like he had been in previous places. Just that the city council wanted to hear what he had to say. So, quote, "May we learn what this new teaching is that you speak of, for you bring some strange notions to our ears. We should like to know what these things mean. Now all the Athenians, as well as foreigners residing there, used their time for nothing else but telling and hearing something new." End quote. Acts 17, verses 19 through 21. So they asked for it, and Paul delivered. He gives then Paul stood up in the Areopagus and said, "You Athenians, I see that in every respect you are very religious. For as I walked around looking carefully at your shrines, I even discovered an altar inscribed to an unknown God. What therefore you unknowingly worship, I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all that is in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in sanctuaries made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, because he needs anything. Rather, it is he who gives to everyone life and breath and everything. He made from one the whole human race to dwell on the entire surface of the earth, and he fixed the ordered seasons and boundaries of the regions, so that people might seek God, even perhaps find him. Though indeed he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said. For we too are his offspring. Since therefore we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divinity is like the image fashioned from gold, silver, or stone by human art and imagination. God has overlooked the times of ignorance, but now he demands that all people everywhere repent, because he has established a day on which he will judge the world with justice through a man he has appointed. And then he goes on. So skipping down. When they heard about resurrection of the dead, some began to scoff, but others said, "We should like to hear you on this some other time." And so Paul left them. But some did join him and became believers. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the court of the Areopagus, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Okay, so in the speech, Paul reveals his familiarity with literature. So that famous line, "In him we live and move and have our being," that is based on an earlier saying of Epimenides of Knossos, which is on the island of Crete. That's recorded, and for we too are his offspring. There Paul is quoting from Aratus of Soli. And anyway, okay. And later he's going to quote from another poet, Menander, from Ephesus. So by way of contrast with previous cities Paul visited, no violent hostility emerged from the synagogue in which he spoke. From the Areopagus, the city council, reactions to his teaching on the resurrection are characteristic. The skeptics and the Epicureans laughed. The Stoics and the Platonists expressed interest in hearing more on philosophical propositions, but no, which was not the point. So it's not an interest of faith. Only a few stayed to hear as genuine seekers of the truth. Among the sincere was this Dionysius, who was a member of the Boule, a member of the city council. He became not only Paul's first Athenian convert that we know of by name, but he later became the first bishop of Athens, and this is Dionysius the Areopagite. Paul then left Athens, traveled 65 miles west, following the coast of the Saronic Gulf, to the Isthmus of Corinth, arriving, Acts 18, verse 1. Like the Isthmus of Panama, connecting North and South America, so also the Isthmus of Corinth is a narrow strip of land linking mainland Greece with the Peloponnese Peninsula to the south, and we've visited this place earlier. On the eastern side, the direction from which Paul first visited, the Saronic Gulf opens into the Aegean Sea at the port of Cenchreae. On the western side of the isthmus is the port of Lycaeum on the Gulf of Corinth, which opens into the Adriatic and there leads to Italy. In 1893, a canal was dredged across the Isthmus of Corinth. So ships can now, it's about a decade before the Panama Canal was dredged, so ships could, and still do because it's still there, move from one body of water to the other without the lengthy voyage around the peninsula. No, more than 10 years. The Panama Canal was finished in 1914. But the Corinthian Canal was 1893. Periander, who was a tyrant of Corinth, 627 through 585 BC, first attempted this feat to dredge a canal through the isthmus, but instrumental limitations prevented his success. So instead, he created the diokos. That's two. It's one Greek word, but a elision of two others. Dia, D-I-A, means a cross, and holkos means a portage, meaning a carrying machine. The diokos was a paved track on which ships could be lifted out of the water from one side, put on this track, and then pulled by a combination of people and animals, pulled across this track, and then lifted off and put on the other side. So it's 6 miles from one side to the other, saving them the circumnavigation of the peninsula, as the canal does today. Anyway, as we visited Corinth before, it endured all the vicissitudes that the previous cities did. The Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonian Conquest, the Diadochi Wars, civil wars culminating in Roman subjugation. The city leaders of Corinth committed the suicidal blunder of fighting against the inevitable Roman conquest, so the city of Corinth was erased in 146 BC. All the males massacred, the females and young children sold into slavery, and the physical structures destroyed. It remained abandoned for a century, until 46 BC, when Julius Caesar rebuilt it to settle veterans of his legions, and he renamed it after himself, the Colonia Laus Julia Corinthiensis, the colony Corinth honoring Julius. So now in the New Testament, it's 100 years after that. By that point, Corinth was a stupendously wealthy double port city with a world-famous temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, serviced by 1,000 female slaves engaged in hierodulia, which is temple prostitution. It also had temples to Apollo, Isis, Poseidon, Hercules, the whole crowd, littered throughout the city. St. Paul spent 18 months at this point, in this pleasure city and commercial emporium, 51-52 or 52-53, depending. But it's recorded in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. From the Saronic port of Cenchreae, where he landed, Paul followed the road to Corinth, entering the city from the southeast. To his left was an immense temple to Octavia, who was a sister of Augustus. Something else the Romans did. There weren't enough false gods. They deified each other periodically. To his right was the Agora, which is the rectangular open-air marketplace of the city. On the far side of the Agora north on the northwest side. He found the passage leading from the agora out to the Lachaean road, heading for the Gulf of Corinth, and on that road was the synagogue, which Paul visited weekly to announce the good news that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled the long-cherished messianic prophecy. There, Paul had an unexpected surprise. Aquila and Priscilla, remember them? They were Christianized Jews who aided St. Peter in Rome, were living in Corinth since the edict of Claudius expelled all Jews from the city because of the disturbances over Christos, which we already mentioned. In Corinth, Paul lived and worked with them as he shared their trade of skenopoi. They were tent makers. Their dwelling became the first house church in Corinth. Quote, "The churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla, together with the church at their house, send you many greetings in the Lord." And that's later Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 16, verse 19. This couple proved to be exceptionally loyal to Paul, which he freely admitted later. Quote, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I am grateful, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Greet also the church at their house." Now, this is later in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, after Jews were allowed to return to Rome, which we'll pick up with in Peter's second stay. But that quote is from Romans chapter 16, verses 3 to 5. For a time, Paul limited his efforts. Quote, "Every Sabbath he entered into discussions in the synagogue, attempting to convince both Jews and Greeks." End quote. That's Acts 18, verse 4. Meaning Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, the Sabomenoi, such as the centurion Cornelius and Lydia in Philippi, whom we've already met. So time passed. Silas and Timothy finally caught up with him from Berea, and they brought with them donation money from Philippi to support the mission. And then, with that money, Paul moved to full-time preaching. They also updated him on the developments of the new Christian communities, which prompted Paul to write the two letters to the Thessalonians that remain part of the New Testament. As occurred routinely, some elements of the Corinthian synagogue deemed Paul guilty of the crime of blasphemy. Okay. Blasphemy, the usual. And their opposition was of such virulence that Paul lost his temper. Quote, "When they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be on your heads. I am clear of responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.'" End quote. Acts 18, verse 6. So this was not the first or the last time that Paul railed in anger in this way, yet he never did entirely give up reaching out to his own people. As it progressed, as his missions progressed, he would eventually spend more time with the Gentiles, but he never completely gave up on the Jews, as we'll see. Still, for the moment, he directed his efforts at that time to the Gentiles. The first family of converts were members of the house of Stephanas, whom Paul personally baptized, which he mentioned later, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18. And Stephanas enjoyed sufficient resources to help them devote themselves to full-time ministry in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 15. One of the Sabomenoi, one of the God-fearing Gentiles attached to the Lachaean Road synagogue, was named Titus Justus. He lived nearby, and he opened his dwelling for Paul's use as a house church. Acts chapter 18, verse 7. The archysynagogos, the synagogue leader, was named Crispus. He, as well as his successor Sosthenes, also embraced Jesus Christ as the Messiah and Redeemer. Acts chapter 18, verse 8, and Acts chapter 18, verse 17. They're also mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 14. Phoebe, a lady, a wealthy lady of means, hosted another house church. This one at Cenchreae. That's on the Aegean side of Corinth. 5 years later, around 57 to 58, Phoebe, delivered Paul's letter to the Christians in Rome. The letter to the Romans. Quote. I gotta. I'm sorry. This is about. I'm sorry. We're having some renovations done to a part of the gym where the bathrooms are that people have to use for mass. And I'm recording this on Saturday, so we're going to have masses, and they're not finished the work, so they're going to have to stop. And anyway, you don't care about that. So, yes. COVID brain. All right, quote. I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a deaconess of the church at Cenchreae, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the holy ones, and help her in whatever way she may need from you, for she has been a benefactor to many and to me as well. Romans chapter 16, verses 1 to 2. History repeated itself again when indignant elements of the synagogue attempted to use Roman law, Roman courts, to silence what they regarded as religious blasphemy. The proconsul, and by this point you know what that title means, Lucius Junius Gallio Annaeus, was an older brother of a guy we've already met, the philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger. He personified local Roman authority. Gallio was a senator, a former consul, appointed as governor of Achaia, which is part of Greece, with his base at Corinth, 51 and 52 A.D. So the synagogue people accused Paul, brought charges. So he was brought to the bema, which is a marble platform used for public addresses and public trials. His Jewish accusers declared, quote, "This man is inducing people to worship God contrary to the law." Acts 18, verse 13. Now, of course, they were not referring to Roman law, but rather to the Torah, Leviticus 24, verse 14. Take the blasphemer outside of the camp and stone him. Now, Gallio instantly understood the difference, so he dismissed the case. Paul's accusers then vented their rage on Sosthenes, gave him a severe beating. Acts chapter 18, verses 12 through 17. Recognizing, yet again, that his presence was, for the moment, causing more harm than good, Paul departed Corinth and went to the eastern port, Cenchreae. There he made the Nazirite vow, after which he, along with Aquila and Priscilla, departed by ship for the Aegean. Eastward, for 210 nautical miles, brought them to Ephesus, one of the 12 cities of ancient Ionia, which we've visited many times. That is 1.8 miles southwest of present Seljuk in Izmir province on the west coast of Turkey. Paul spoke in the synagogue and received encouragement in the form of an invitation to stay longer. He did not accept at that moment, but promised to return. Acts chapter 18, verses 19 to 20. And of course, he would later return. At that moment, though, he continued by ship to Caesarea Maritima on the west coast of the Holy Land. Then he went inland to visit Jerusalem, then returned north to Antioch on the Orontes in present-day Syria, 3 years and 2,500 miles after he had departed. Returning home, Acts chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. In 51 A.D., during Paul's second missionary journey, St. Matthias suffered martyrdom. St. Matthias was the one in Acts chapter 1, verses 21 to 26, was the one who was chosen to replace the traitor Judas Iscariot as one of the 12. Previously, Matthias had been one of the 70 disciples chosen by Jesus. And after the dispersion of the apostles, Matthias went to Antioch on the Orontes. From there, 160 miles northeast to Samosata. then 54 miles northwest to Mytilene in the province of Cappadocia, then 20 miles northeast to Dasavza, then 73 miles northeast to Draconis, and so on, until he covered the 546 miles from Antioch northeast to Colchis. That is present Igrisi in the nation of Georgia, on the southeastern side of the Black Sea. So it's just to the north of the northern border with Turkey. Between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, where Matthias was, he preached in Armenia, making Armenia one of the most ancient sites for the continuous presence of Christianity. And Armenia is, still Christian. I mean, obviously, it's not only Christians that live there, but the national faith, so to speak, of Armenia has been Christian for 2,000 years. Matthias lived according to the severe ascetic practices of St. John the Baptist. He was martyred in 51 AD by beheading. His remains were in the Gonio fortress in Ajara, which is the present-day nation of Georgia, 9.3 miles south of Batumi, which is at the foot of the Lesser Caucasus Mountains. And that's only 2.5 miles north of the present Turkish border. St. Helena later brought some of the relics to the west, and they're still in Italy. Some in the Abbey of Santa Justina in Padua, and others in Germany, the Abbey of St. Matthias in Trier, Germany. The conclusion of St. Paul's second missionary journey around 53 AD brings us to a point at which we can once more synchronize growth of the early empire with events in the Roman Empire. Growth in the early church with events in the Roman Empire, as we catch up with St. Peter. When we last spent time with the first pope, Peter, along with the Christians in Rome and all the Jews in Rome, were expelled from the city by order of the fourth emperor Claudius to end disturbances of the peace caused by conflicts over Peter's declaration that Jesus was the Christ. St. Paul met the two of those displaced Jewish converts, Aquila and Priscilla, during his stay in Corinth. But Peter had at that point moved on to visit towns of Pontus. And then Paul returned to Antioch after his 3 years. So the year after Paul returned to Antioch, which brings us to the year 54 AD, the reign of Claudius, the fourth emperor, came to an end, and his successor, Nero, the fifth emperor, allowed Jews, and therefore Christians, to return to the city of Rome. Nero did this because he detested Claudius, so he reversed all of his predecessor's decisions. Now, initially, this was viewed as a kindness, but the permission had the unforeseen, malign consequence of facilitating the first imperial persecution of Christians a decade later. Oh, okay, so Peter, to catch up with what he's been doing, Peter had occupied himself during the Claudian banishment by his own missionary expedition along the southern shore of the Black Sea, accompanied by between 12 and 16 disciples. After settling back in Rome, Peter wrote to them the letter, the First Peter, the letter that's in the New Testament, the first papal letter, and in chapter 1, verse 1, quote, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the sojourners scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Okay, so who are these people? Acts chapter 2, verse 9, records that people from Pontus were present in Jerusalem at the first Pentecost. And Acts chapter 18, verse 2, informs us that Aquila, whom we've already met, was a Jew from Pontus originally, before Peter met him in Rome. Pontus, that's Pontus, is just the word for sea. So it's a Latin rendering of the Greek word Pontos, Pontos, for sea, one of the words for sea. The word Pontus referred to a province on the southern coast of the Black Sea, east of the river Halys, from the river Halys up to Colchis, where we just saw St. Matthias. So in other words, Pontus was the northern coast, sort of northeastern coast of present-day Turkey. The neighboring province of Bithynia was also mentioned by Peter, as said in the list. Bithynia was stolen by Rome in 74 BC. Pontus was stolen by Rome in 63 BC. The region of Pontus included the coast between Heraclea to Amisus. So that's present-day Erigil to Samsun. Parts of it were encompassed within the province of Galatia. In 62 AD, when Peter was back in Rome, the province was redrawn on imperial maps and divided into 3 districts. The Pontus Galaticus on the west, bordering Galatia. The Pontus Polemonicus in the center, with the capital of Palamonium. And the Pontus Cappadocius in the east, bordering on Cappadocia, which the Romans called Armenia Minor, or Lesser Armenia, smaller Armenia. Subsequently, the Roman Emperor Trajan moved Pontus, or reclassified Pontus, as part of the province of Cappadocia itself. Galatia, as we've already visited, which Peter mentions, but we've already visited that on Paul's journey, so we'll move on. Cappadocia, which he mentions, was also listed as having people present in Jerusalem for the first Pentecost in Acts 2, chapter 9. Acts chapter 2, verse 9. Cappadocia was reduced to a client king relationship with Rome in 63 BC, and then that was just erased, and it was reduced further to the status of a province in 17 AD. Cappadocia was inland in central Anatolia. Now that area is divided into 7 provinces in present-day Turkey, central eastern Turkey. It was south of Pontus, north of the Taurus Mountains, east of Galatia, west of the river Euphrates. And it will figure later in this history as the home to the Cappadocian Fathers, Saint Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. Gregory of Nyssa. Eusebius tells us that Peter focused his efforts in this period on preaching to Jews of the dispersion like Aquila. Jerome said the same, but phrased it as believers in the circumcision. So Eusebius, that's book 3, chapter 1, section 2. And Jerome, in his list of illustrious men, number 1, Peter's the first illustrious man. After 5 years of doing missionary work in this region, from 49 to 54 AD, Peter was able to return to Rome, with the death of Claudius and Nero lifting the exile. Mindful of the conflicts that provoked the exile in the first place, Peter this time settled outside of Rome, outside of the Servian walls, northeast of the city. At least the footprint of the city then. Now it's all within the city. At the time, it was called the Palus Capri, the Goat Marsh. Now it's beneath the Church of St. Agnes Fiori La Mura, the Basilica of St. Agnes outside the walls. It is on another of the Roman roads, the Via Nomentana. At the entrance, now it's at the entrance to the catacombs of the same name. So if you go to Rome, that's where Peter was lit. That in his, it was his third residence, but in his first residence, he lived at two different places, at least, possibly 3. But this is his second residence. This is where he sets up on the Via Nomentana. The Liber Pontificalis, the Book of Popes, number 1, chapter 1, recorded that Peter was bishop in Antioch for 7 years, and then bishop in Rome for 25 years, meaning that officially the church considered Peter to have remained bishop of Rome continuously, even during the Claudian exile from the city. Further, same chapter in the Liber Pontificalis establishes the early continuity of holy orders, recording that Peter ordained personally 7 deacons, 10 priests, and 3 bishops. It even stipulated that he did this in the month of December, but it did not preserve the year or the exact date. Further, this reveals the original papal succession methodology as being selection and ordination as bishop by Peter to keep the apostolic succession intact. The three bishops he ordained were Linus, Cletus, and Clement. Each served as pope in that sequence. The same books, the LP, still includes a prayer, the prayer that Peter used in the ordination. Quote: "As unto me was delivered by my Lord Jesus Christ the power to govern and to bind and to loose, so also I commit it unto thee, that thou mayest ordain stewards over divers matters, who will carry onward the work of the church, and may thyself not become engrossed with the cares of the world, but mayest strive to give thyself solely to prayer and preaching to the people." End quote. The same source, the LP, the Liber Pontificalis, preserves the tradition of multiple confrontations between Peter and Simon Magus in Rome. St. Jerome says that Peter held the sacerdotal chair in Rome for 25 years, until the 14th year of Nero, which would be the year 67 to 68 AD. Jerome also recorded that Peter wrote 2 epistles, which are called Catholic, though he noted that the second letter of St. Peter was doubted by some, owing to the difference in style. Jerome took no stand on the question and made no comment on the content of the epistles or the Gospel of Mark, apart from, quote, "Then too the Gospel according to Mark, who was his disciple and interpreter, is ascribed to Peter." Jerome excluded from Petrine authorship 5 texts which, in his day, were widely attributed to Peter. These are the Acts of Peter, the Gospel of Peter, the Preaching of Peter, and the Revelation to Peter, and his judgment. Jerome rejected these as apocryphal. This reveals to us another problem, another vector of satanic attack, and that is forged documents by heretical Christians, specifically Gnostic heretics, such as Simon Magus, whom Peter had his multiple confrontations with. Gnosticism, remember, that's dualism, so it's a paganized version of Christianity. So in these works, one will find Gnostic teaching, a Gnostic perspective on the divinity, on the nature of creation, on the nature of the material world. So that's how we know they're not authentic. But it is revealing. I mean, they might also, I mean, they're interesting to read, and they might, since they were written in antiquity, they might include facts that were just taken for granted then, that are facts, so that they can be used, but with caution, and never as a source for theology. Okay, St. Peter most certainly would have lived a happier life if he had remained in Pontus instead of returning to Rome when he did. Nero employed the domestic terror strategy of Tiberius, making use of malicious prosecution, we covered earlier, including the infinitely elastic crime of maiestas, meaning a crime against the majesty of Rome. What does that mean? Tiberius had used it to ruin those of whom he was jealous, and now Nero did the same thing. Or to ruin those of Nero's favorites, those who were enemies of Nero's favorites. So this was early in his reign, before his homicidal sadism became uncontrollable, and then he just stopped using the courts and just did like Caligula, which is just direct murder. Okay, Peter in this second Roman stay. In this we meet Saint Aurelia Petronilla. She was cured, St. Peter cured her of some kind of palsy during his second Roman residency, baptized her into the faith. Her feast day is May 31st. Her remains, along with those of later saints, Saints Nereus and Achilles, were discovered in the catacombs of St. Domitilla. Domitilla was a descendant, not a direct descendant of Petronilla because she was a virgin, but a descendant of the same family. The gens Aurelia. So Domitilla, as well as Nereus and Achilles, were both martyred in a later persecution by the Emperor Domitian, who we'll meet in due course. Her tomb, this is on the Via Ardientina. In the catacombs of Domitilla, we find a painting on a closing stone of a tomb in the underground crypt, which depicts St. Petronilla receiving a deceased Christian named Varianda into heaven, indicating she was a martyr. So, the belief was that she was, our martyrs were already in heaven. And that, in case there was any doubt, there's an inscription that says Petronilla M-A-R-T, so Petronilla martyr. Petronilla's father was Titus Flavius Petronius. His great-grandson, Titus Flavius Clemens, became a consul of Rome while being a secret Christian. And we shall meet them again because they were murdered by the Emperor Domitian. Another of St. Peter's converts during his second Roman stay was a patrician lady named Pomponia Graecina, whom he baptized with the name Lucina, and she's now recognized as a saint by that name, Saint Lucina. Her feast day, June 30th. She was not only a patrician, but she was related to the Julio-Claudians, and she married a general, Aulus Plautius, who's the one who conquered Rome, stole Britain for Rome from 43 to 47 A.D. Lucina's father was Gaius Pomponius Graecinus. He was a friend of the poet Ovid and elected consul in 16 A.D. Lucina's mother, Assinia, was daughter of Gaius Asinius Gallus, who was also a consul, elected in 8 B.C. Her maternal grandmother, St. Lucina's maternal grandmother, was Vipsania. She was a daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who was the admiral who won the Battle of Actium for Augustus, and then as a reward got to marry Augustus's daughter Julia, his only daughter by Augustus's first marriage. So in this way, the Lady Pomponia Graecina, or St. Lucina, was related to the Julio-Claudian imperial family. Okay, and we're going to meet her again. So now Nero's the one who let Peter get back in Rome and to conduct this ministry. So who is Nero? Nero, the fifth emperor of Rome, was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15th, 37 A.D. Born in Antium, only 9 months after Caligula became the third princeps et imperator on March 16th, 37 A.D. Officially, Nero was the only son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, and his wife, Agrippina the Younger, or Agrippinilla. Though given the incest in the family, it is possible that Nero was actually the son of Caligula, his mother's insane brother. That would explain a great deal about Nero's mental health and his behavior. But in any case, 2 years later, on June 10th, 38 A.D., Caligula murdered one of his sisters, Drusilla, who was pregnant with his child. And he banished the 2 surviving sisters, including Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius, died in 41 A.D., at which point Caligula stole Nero's inheritance and sent him to live with Nero's own paternal aunt, Domitia Lepida the Younger. Domitia was the mother of Claudius's third wife, Valeria Messalina. Caligula, as we've seen, was assassinated on the 24th of January, 41 A.D. Claudius became the fourth princeps et imperator. Claudius was the uncle of both Caligula as well as Nero's mother, Agrippina. Maintaining the family custom of incest, Agrippina persuaded Claudius to marry her and to adopt Nero as his son. Claudius gave in and did both in 49 A.D. 2 years later, in 51 A.D., Agrippina managed to get Claudius to agree to the marriage of Claudius's own daughter, Octavia, to Nero, who now was the stepsister. But stepsister, given this family dynamic, that's pretty distant in relationship. So having extracted all that she could from the living Claudius, Agrippina poisoned him on October 13th, 54 AD. So, because the only thing left to extract was to extract from his death, and that is his position as princeps et imperator. And she succeeded. So her son Nero became princeps et imperator number 5. Nero was only 16 years old at the time, so the imperial curse doomed him to irreversible insanity. Although, like the previous one, Caligula, it may not be fair to put him on the list because he was already insane. But, during his first years as emperor, Nero's young age, combined with his natural indolence, made him content to delegate administration of the empire to his mother, along with his tutor, the Stoic philosopher we've already met, Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect, Afranius Burrus. Nero would have been much better remembered by history if he had let that continue. And we know this because they did pretty well. In those years, under their planning, a general Corbulo defeated the Parthians in Nero's name. Another general, Suetonius Paulinus, crushed the revolt of Queen Boudicca in Britain in Nero's name. And the Bosporan kingdom, which is present-day Crimea, was added to the empire. Remember, Nero gets credit for all of this, even though he's not doing anything. He's the emperor, so, rightly or wrongly, whoever's in charge gets the credit for what's good. Just as rightly or wrongly, they get the blame when things go bad. Their diligence freed Nero to indulge himself as a patron of the arts, of public entertainment, and of public festivities. As a result, he was enormously popular in these early years with the common people. Because remember, all this entertainment, that's the bread and circuses, means that free admission, free booze, and free bread, and free entertainment. Correlatively, he was resented by the upper classes because all of this was funded by tax theft from them. Now, Nero's mental instability, there's no getting away from it. I don't want to mock. I guess I shouldn't mock, but because mental illness really is, it is a tragedy, as it was for Nero, and as with many tragedies, more often than not, the innocent are made to suffer. So his instability began to manifest in 55 AD when he murdered his stepbrother Britannicus, and began copulating with a slave named Acte against his mother's wishes. Now, for most of his life, Agrippina had controlled her son Nero through incest, that's just what this family did. And just as Agrippina and her sisters had tried, and for several years managed to control their brother Caligula when he was emperor. Her poisoning of Claudius brought Nero to the throne, so she felt, entitled. And she relished the power, initially, that she got what she wanted, that he endowed her with. But now, once Nero starts copulating with another female, she feared the rival, who was younger, the rivalry for emotional ascendancy over Nero, and she had to know, that he was mentally fragile, and that would be a threat to her. But in the case, between the mother and the lover, Nero sided with the lover, and he sent his mother away from Rome. So he banished her from the city, but to a palace. Not a dungeon, but it's excluding her from the power that she had enjoyed. And to give her credit, she did well, in those first years when she was de facto empress. 2 years later, in 57 AD, Nero had one of his creatures named Publius Sullius charge the son of one of Peter's converts with maestas, an offense against the sovereign majesty of Rome. So the charge, this is Peter's convert Pomponia Graecina, who's Saint Lucina. Her son was Aulus Plautius the Younger, who was the son of the famous general who conquered Britain. Now, the real reason, maestas, what does that mean? Offending the sovereign majesty of Rome? Again, it's infinitely elastic. So it's just, in fact, maestas means the person is actually innocent of a real crime. So they just use this, because that could be anything. So the real offense was that Nero's mother, whom Nero had banished her from the palace, so she had fallen in love with this Aulus Plautius the Younger, making Nero jealous. So even though Nero had dumped his mother and ceased copulating with her and instead was copulating with the slave Acte, he still didn't want his mother copulating with anyone else. And more so, Nero remembered what his mother had done to Claudius, and Nero poisoned Claudius to put Nero on the throne. So and this was a plausible concern, that she might arrange for Nero to be poisoned in order to put her current lover, Aulus Plautius, on the throne. And he was a popular young man, the son of a successful general, so that was a very plausible concern given, given the way these people conducted themselves. So continuing the vendetta, he had his creatures charge St. Lucina herself with, quote, foreign superstition, unquote, in the same year, 57 AD. Now, considering the religious history of Rome, which we've covered already, the charge of foreign superstition borders on hilarious. Yet, that same history we covered provides us a clue in revealing that the accusation was really of being a Christian. From the Roman perspective, worshiping any deities from any pantheon was accepted and encouraged. Yet, because of that, the reverse, the refusal to worship the gods of Rome, or the refusal to worship any gods except, one, would naturally raise suspicion because that just didn't compute to the Romans. So you may be wondering, how did the Jews get away with it? Well, remember how the Jews came into the empire as part of a client-king arrangement. And because of that, the Romans viewed the Jews in a corporate way. And the Jews at this period still had the temple in Jerusalem. And the Jews assured the Roman authorities that we routinely, in our temple, pray for the well-being of the empire. And that made sense to the Romans. That computed to the Romans. Okay, this is a group. They're in a client relationship with Rome, and they have a temple. They this is this group's temple, and so that was a category that the Roman mind could understand. But Christians didn't have that. They weren't licensed, so to speak. They didn't have that corporate recognition yet, and so for them to refuse or to deny the existence of other gods of all the gods of Rome except one, without the compensation of saying, okay, we have our holy place, and in this holy place we do pray for your well-being, then that's a problem for the Romans because it doesn't compute. There's no category for that. So this is the irony that Romans who worship anything then accuse the Christians of superstition, an alien superstition, a foreign superstition, because for them to doubt the existence of the 100,000 gods and to reject the existence of all these other gods, and believe there's only one, for the Romans that was superstitious because they believed in the infinite multiplicity of deities. Okay, the following year, 58 AD, the prosecutor himself, whom we've already met, the one who prosecuted St. Lucina and her son, Aulus Plautius the Younger, was himself the beast, the government turned on its own, as is often the case with tyrannies, and he was convicted of maestas. His property was stolen by the government. In the same year, Nero began an affair with someone else. Now, this was not a slave Acte. This was a woman who was much more of a threat because she was a patrician, Poppaea Sabina the Younger. The next year, and the significance being, whereas the slave Acte could never become empress, this lady could because she was a patrician, so Nero could plausibly marry her. The next year, and so his mother, Nero's mother, Agrippina, recognized that this is a double threat. Not only the same threat as Acte posed, as a rival for Nero's affection, for his emotional control, but this lady had presented that problem, but also the political threat. And Agrippina started to intrigue, to plot. And so that led to the next year, March 23rd, 59 AD, Nero had his mother murdered. He did not do the deed himself. He sent a freedman named Anicetus to do it. Next, Nero had his own wife, Octavia, remember his stepsister, accused of adultery, and executed. So executed from Aestas, because of course adultery against the emperor, well, that's an offense against the Maestas, the majesty of Rome, so that merits being murdered. Then Nero's free to marry, so he marries Poppaea Sabina, installing her as empress. She survived until he murdered her when she was pregnant. Supposedly he kicked her to death when she was pregnant, and doesn't know if he was really going to kill her, if he was just a wife beater. But because she was pregnant, then she hemorrhaged and died. But whether he intended it or not, he murdered her. But the following year, after the murder of his previous wife Octavia, so this brings us to 60 A.D., a guy named Rubilius Plautius was exiled, was convicted of gossiping against the emperor, and exiled and his property stolen. The following year, 61 occurred. The following year in 61, the reverse occurred. 5 of Nero's favorites forged a will, naming themselves and Nero as heirs to the estate of a very wealthy but childless elderly man named Domitius Balbus. They were caught and prosecuted. And this was under a real law, not just, the elastic Maestas. This was the Lex Cornelia, which pertained to exactly that, because the Romans did have a legal system. I mean, he's undermining it, but they did have, so fraud in this way to try to exploit and steal the property, from a childless person was fraud. That was a crime. So they were convicted because they were guilty, but Nero pardoned them because they were his friends. In 62 A.D., the Praetorian prefect, Afranius Burrus, died, officially of throat cancer, which removed yet another constraint from Nero's younger days. So, even though he was crazy, but as a child, he remembered Burrus as though he's an older guy, an authority figure who did well in his work. So he did, to the extent that Nero could respect anyone, so that Burrus would have been somewhat of a check from the younger days. So Burrus died. And Agrippina was now murdered, so that's a second one. And so that left only Seneca was the only one left, an authority figure from Nero's early days. And of course, Seneca was a Stoic philosopher who would, had tutored Nero, try to imbue him with Stoic principles. None of this behavior conforms to that. So there was escalating, not confrontation. Seneca was not the type to. He certainly didn't scream at the emperor, but trying to wean the emperor away, especially from Poppaea Sabina, who was ambitious, trying to wean him away from that and back to the Stoic path. At first, Nero only made Seneca retire. Didn't kill him because he still had a little residue of respect for his old teacher. But then time passed, and he was invited to commit suicide. Seneca was invited to commit suicide. Now, there's a theory. Nero gets blamed for it, of course, and he, ultimately he is responsible. But it's probable, since he was not just murdered, not just given the sword like his mother was, that Nero didn't do it himself, but that the next Praetorian prefect, who was one of Nero's stooges, felt that Seneca, as long as he was alive, could be a threat. So in Nero's name, had the order sent to Seneca to commit suicide. And that Seneca, who had seen Nero's deterioration, didn't question for a moment that it was an authentic order, so did, in fact, commit suicide. But in any case, he did. Seneca was dead. In 62, an elected praetor, so that's the second highest magistrate in Rome, an elected praetor named Anistius Socianus was prosecuted for Maestas. The deed, he composed and recited a poem that he read publicly that lampooned Nero. That was, like a comedy routine, making fun of Nero. Well, that's treason, right? Well, under the law of Maestas, it could be, because there's already a treason law giving aid and comfort to the enemy in time of war, but that's too specific. So Maestas, offending the majesty of Rome, that could be anything, including a poem. Such examples could be repeated for pages and pages. We could go on with all the stuff that happened. But these should suffice to reveal that the degradation of the famed Roman legal system, beginning with Tiberius and all of his prosecutions of political enemies for the vague crime of maestas, that degradation was by Nero's reign complete. That was no longer possible to pretend that the law was anything other than a weapon, arbitrarily wielded by those with power against those without. This provides the essential context to comprehend how Nero was able to treat the Christians the way that he did. And the trigger for that was a fire in Rome, the city of Rome, that erupted on the night of, the night of the 18th, but it burned for a week. So it started on the night of the 18th of July, 64 A.D. It started on the slope of the Aventine Hill looking over the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus is still, it's not, it's in ruins, but you can still see the footprint of where it was in Rome. The fire burned for over a week and destroyed significant portions of the city. So that will lead to Nero's persecution of the church, and that'll lead us into a whole nother thing. I'm thinking before we get to that, we might pause and cover two patristic documents, the Didache and the Letter of Barnabas, that are not in the church, but now we're moving. Not in the New Testament, but we're moving now into the period. So we'll either start with those and then move into the fire and the persecution, or do it in the reverse. We'll cover all of it, but in that order. So for the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.